Good morning or afternoon, depending on where you're at. My name is Jasmine Knighton. I am one of the optimizers here at Vine Skills. I help folks get launched into Filevine as well as FVDA and help to put on these free help sessions for you all each week.
Hello, my name is Amy McGovern. I am also another optimizer here at Vine Skills. I also help clients get launched in Filevine and optimize once they have been in Filevine as well.
Awesome. So just a few housekeeping things. If you all have questions throughout, feel free to use the Q&A feature at the bottom as Amy goes through giving you tips and tricks on task flows and deadline chains today. We'll be monitoring that Q&A to get those questions answered for you. So feel free. We mentioned that we work at Vine Skills. Vine Skills is a great company that, as Amy mentioned, does optimization launches and then also all of the auxiliary services. So lead, docket, outlaw, and a whole host of other things. So if you need any of those services, definitely feel free to reach out to us. I'll drop our info in the chat so that you have it, as well as our website so that you all can peruse. If you are not current customers, if you are current customers, it's so great to see you. And hopefully we get some good knowledge here today. So I'll let Amy go ahead and take it away.
All right, thank you, Jasmine. All right, so we'll just go ahead and dive in. I'm going to share my screen for most of our webinar today and kind of walk through tips and tricks in task flows and deadline chains. There's a lot of actually things that you can incorporate in task flows that a lot of people aren't aware of, a lot of data that you can actually pull into your task flows and different other things that you can use to help maximize and optimize the task flow for your firm without literally using a task for every single item that you need a staff member to complete. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. All right, we've got a test case here, Gandalf, great. And we're going to kind of walk through some tasks that I've already built for us to kind of talk about. First thing I've got here is I've got a task that I had triggered from a phase change. So it was triggered, and I went ahead and triggered it for us prior to our webinar today, just so I could kind of walk through some of what is going on in this task here. But as most of you may know, tasks are triggered two ways. You can trigger it by a phase change or an action button. And then by those triggers, they can also have tasks by completion, triggering by completion of another task as well. So what's going on in this task here is that I created this initial task in a file setup phase here. And I've done a couple of formatting things that I'll show you in the back end that you can do. And it just kind of helps guide the eye to some important items. Complete file setup checklist in task flow checklist section here. So what I've done here is done some formatting, and then I've actually added in a link to the section that I need it to travel to. And then I've just added in some instructions. Hey, let's not complete this task until this entire checklist is complete. So let's talk about this checklist that I've created here. This is something that we like to utilize with some of our clients at Vine Skills to keep from overtasking staff. Sometimes you've got things that occur early on in a file setup, just like letters of rep need to go out, subro letters, we need to collect a police report, things like that, that you don't necessarily want to have a task for every single one of those things, because the paralegals, the claims managers or claims assistants, they're going to have maybe like 10 tasks that I'll trigger at once. And then maybe that's a problem that you're having, is that people aren't completing their tasks. So when you're running reports, you have all these incomplete tasks everywhere. So this is something that we build for those firms that are having those kinds of struggles. We have one major task that goes to our task flow checklist here. So this is actually what's called a multi-select field. You can still run reports on this and of course that task itself. And your staff can actually just go in here and actually just check. Just check through the checklist saying, okay, we've got this signed HIPAA, we've got this signed contract, we've confirmed all the intake information, we've completed the case assignments here. We've set that SOL date, copy health insurance. So you just go down the list here and make sure everything is checked. Maybe some of this doesn't apply. For instance, if you have maybe they don't have health insurance. So you can actually just add a note here in the file setup notes right here. And then if you want to add a yes or no box here and click yes and add in that date of completion. You don't necessarily need that date of completion if you've got our leading task here, because you can just simply click complete and complete that task. Another thing that I have some of my clients do that utilize this checklist item instead of having a bunch of tasks that are over inundating their staff is that they're always asking me, well, how do they know, where they're at in their checklist without having to go all the way to that section? I tell them, hey, tell your staff just to make notes here, like contacted police department, waiting on report finalization. And then you can just continue, your staff member can continue to add those notes in here on those checklist items, so that anybody that pops in can say, oh, they're still working on the file setup Taskflows checklist. And this is kind of what's going on. Oh, they called the police department on Monday. They said, hey, that officer will have that finalized by Friday. So it's kind of like it just kind of organizes your data. And so that's kind of like one fun little tip and trick here. Another task flow that I like to use that some people don't know that occurs, or maybe overuse them, are the repeating tasks. So for personal injury specifically, I think repeating tasks are great for that treatment phase where the client, you've already done everything, set up the file, LORs are out, and your client's in that treatment phase. And that means you're just kind of you're waiting for them to complete treatment. And that's usually the point in personal injury where we lose contact with that client. How can we prevent to do that? Let's add a repeating task. And I'll go in the back end on this too, once I demonstrate this for you and show you kind of what that looks like and talk through some of it here in just a moment. So I'm going to go ahead and change the phase, and we'll just give it just a moment. There we go. And here's another thing I did. In our poor Gandalf here, I forgot to add a phone number, so that's why that's blank. So I actually used some of the document generation codes in our task here to pull in the information, so that staff member that's going to contact the client doesn't actually have to go into the contact card and pull it. So it pulls in the client's name, and it does pull a phone number, but our poor Gandalf here actually doesn't have a phone number. And then check the status of their medical treatment and enter that updated medical providers in the medical section. And I added a little link right here for the staff member to click on and travel to the medical section. So that gives them enough information and helps guide them to where's the next step that they need to go to find that information. And then I added again just another little instructions just at the bottom, and I like to format it differently. And again, I'll kind of show you that here in a moment, what those codes look like. And I'll also, there's a helpful article from the Filevine Help Center that has these codes that you can use anywhere in the activity section and in your instruction fields. So this code, this instruction text is just letting the staff member know that, hey, this task is recurring and it's going to populate again. And I have it set up for 30 days. So because as we know, clients can sometimes call in pretty frequently. So maybe you talk to them Monday, they can turn around and call 5 days later wanting an update or providing an update. So for this particular task, I have it repeat. I have it generate automatically in treatment, but not be due for 30 days. So you'll see that we generated it today and it's going to be due on September 1st. And then if I complete it today and go ahead and hit that complete, it's actually going to repopulate tomorrow. So I add that instruction text in here. So the staff member knows, hey, that's how this operates. So they don't think the task is actually duplicating. Well, they're like, oh, well, I completed this task yesterday. Well, this allows you, you have that 30-day actually until it's actually due, but it gives you the flexibility to be able to complete that task at any time in those 30 days. If you wait and have it not generate until the due date, then if that client calls in between, then you don't have the option to be able to complete that task. So this gives you the flexibility. Sometimes it may drive staff crazy if it generates the next day, but as long as we have this instruction text in here that lets them know, hey, it's not going to be due for another 30 days, as long as they keep that due date in mind, then hopefully it'll help guide them a little bit, which is what that instruction text right here is for. All right, so those are just a couple of little tricks here. So let me pop into the back end here and show you what these tasks look like there. Let me share my full screen now here. All right, so I am back in our advanced area under Taskflows. And of course, as we mentioned, we have the two phases and action buttons. I built these in phases. So we're going to pop in our file setup. So I'm going to pop open and show you guys kind of what this looks like. So there's different codes that Filevine has that you can use to format certain items. The double underscore on either side of your phrasing is going to be bold. If you do one underscore is italicized, and these are just for visual aspects. Maybe you want to put emphasis on certain things. It's just, it looks nice, things like that. Or why I utilize those formatting in Taskflows. It kind of breaks the monotony of just plain text and helps bring attention to the data items that the staff member may need. And here's my little link area. So what I did here was, and again, I'll show you the article at the Filevine Help Center, but I pulled the link from the actual section that I'm wanting to guide them to. So this one is our task flow checklist section. I took the link here, the URL, copied and pasted it, and then here is the project ID. So this is what Filevine assigns to every single project that is created. It assigns that project ID automatically. And this is the identifier Filevine has natively in it for to know that this is what the project's kind of their name is inside computer software language. So the code that I plugged in for that, which again is kind of like a DocGen code, it's going to be the ID code right here. So that this is for this to work on any case. So when this triggers, it'll pull in that project ID and add it to the URL. So it will work, the link will work on any case. And here you will see, it creates automatically and it's due in 30 days. Creating and making due is, you kind of can play with that for some stuff that makes sense for your firm. When it's early on in a case, I'll usually have them create pretty automatically, especially if it's something, if you don't want to go down the checklist route. Maybe you want to have, so you do want to have a task for certain things. Every firm functions differently. So maybe you do have 5 tasks that all populate at the same time initially, and staff members complete them in different orders. You don't need to have a completely linear process. Maybe you even have more of a tree of task flows that need to occur. I know sometimes with firms that have done, I think, for example, would have been employment law. I had a client that had very complex task flow. And I said, well, hey, why don't you sit down and make a flow chart? Because she was having a hard time visualizing. And creating that flow chart outside of Filevine, she was able to visualize, okay, this is how I want things to trigger. And maybe sometimes people that are more visual, like myself, that's helpful. So keep that in mind with tasks. And let's take a look at that repeating task. So it took me a while as a paralegal before I came to Vine Skills. I worked as a paralegal in Filevine, and I tried to figure out this repeating task, and it finally clicked in my head one day. So here again, I used all these formatting items, and there is that DocGen code that I was mentioning for the client's name. So it pulls in the client's full name and then their phone number. Keep in mind when you're using these DocGen codes, they still apply for the same rules that it would for a document. You can't pull collection section data unless you're using an action button in that particular collection section. So I'll also show you an action button in the medical section that pulls in data as well. And so that will make a little bit more sense.
And you don't have to go into the DocGen setup to get these codes. You can use the little question mark right next to task text. Yeah. And then it will show you just below replacement field list, and you can click on that and see all of the ones that are available to you.
And I don't know if they'll generate in our sandbox because we have a bunch of fields, but yes, thank you, Jasmine. All right, awesome. So for the repeating tasks here, you can have it generate, when you want to, specifically for this client contact repeating task, just because, as I mentioned, they can call in at any time. I go ahead and have it create immediately when the phase changes, and then have it do in however long you guys want to have that contact period. Some people do 60 days, 90 days. It just depends, especially if maybe we want to set up a different client contact repeating task in litigation, because as we all know, litigation just moves slower than it does in pre-litigation. I'll see clients set those up differently in litigation. Another thing to keep in mind when you're doing repeating tasks, the task does have to be triggered by a phase change. You cannot set up a repeating task when an auto task is completed. That cannot be the trigger. It does have to be when the phase changes to have that repeating task. And to make that repeating task, you just check the little box here for repeat task. And then, so you'll see here, I say repeat every 1 day. And the reason I say repeat every 1 day is because I'm wanting this task to be completed in every 30-day increments. I want client contact every 30 days so we don't lose that contact with the client. If you want it at 60, then you could change this to 60, or even do 30 here, 30 days here and 30 here. I personally think this is a clean way to do it. Just as I mentioned, because clients will call in just whenever, and especially if they're just a repeat caller, I think this just makes it a little cleaner. And as I mentioned earlier, so as soon as you complete this task, it will turn around and trigger the next day to be due in that 30 days. And here is another box that you'll want to make sure. I think it defaults actually to this box. It says only repeat when the project is still in that treatment phase. Otherwise, this task will repeat until the case is archived. So I do have some clients that do like to do that. They do have like a 30-day rule throughout the whole life of a case. Doesn't matter the phase. If that's the case, you would uncheck this box. However, if this is just a task we're wanting to have just for the treatment phase, then we're going to want to make sure that that box is checked. Also, if maybe the assigned to role changes throughout the life of the case, maybe you have a pre-lit case manager and then a litigation paralegal, then you may want to look at setting this up differently for each phase. I do have clients that set up the repeating tasks different for treatment and then litigation. As I mentioned, maybe that rotation for the calling turns into 90 days or 60 days once you hit into litigation. So those are kind of just repeating tasks, helpful guides. You can also set up repeating tasks in action buttons. So let's pop into action buttons now and take a look at those. The most popular place I see action button task flows are in, specifically PI or in medical. Action buttons are great for when you need a task flow that can occur anywhere in the life of the case, doesn't matter what phase it's in. For example, medical records collection can occur at any time throughout the life of a case, unfortunately, especially if you're in discovery. You're sitting in the middle of a deposition, a client mentions a doctor nobody's ever heard of. Now you're turning around trying to collect medical records. So we have medical here, and those action buttons are great for collection sections as well. So we'll just go in and trigger our little task flow button here. And if you've never triggered an action button task flow, a task flow button, give it just a second, you will have data right here for who activated it, on what date, and at what time. And if you are a project admin, then you could reset this button. So I utilize this as a paralegal in Filevine, and it was helpful for me. Oh, let me go back and make sure that I had I triggered this for the medical records clerk. Okay, cool. I did trigger that last week after I talked to the client. They finished PT. I needed to request just PT on this provider because they're still going back to their primary care. That's kind of, again, why I like action buttons for medical records requests. It also just depends on the staff members you have. If you have, multiple people requesting medical records and they can follow up on it, this button's great. Sometimes it's easier just to do a report. So you're not getting overtasked again. All right, so now let's go take a look at our task here in the activity. And it says follow up on records and bills. And you'll notice here there is you can have a link where you can travel back to the collection item entry for where that task flow was. And go back into activity here and what section it is in and what button it was triggered by. So there's a lot of super helpful data for where this occurs. And again, just like we were talking about, you can actually go into our back end here and medical and add in that medical provider name. Here and in our code to pull in their name, you can pull in fax numbers, anything that is in that item, and it will only pull it in for that one entry because that's where the button lives, just like it does for document generation as well. Same thing on repeating tasks. If you're wanting to create a repeating task in action buttons, and I'll talk about a little bit about pros and cons on using a repeating task in an action button. You do have to use the trigger by the initial button, not for when another auto task is completed. And then you click repeat task, and then you can set up the same thing like you would in a task that is triggered by a phase. Now, the only thing about repeating tasks and action buttons is the only way to get it to stop is to travel into where the action button is and click that reset. That's the only way to get that repeating task for an action button to stop repeating. And there's a couple issues with that, generally speaking, when you utilize repeating tasks that way. I've seen clients, the staff members don't remember to go back in there and reset. Some people also, the staff members that need the action or the task to stop repeating, may not actually have the ability because to be able to reset an action button, you actually have to be a project admin. And sometimes if you're using this for medical records, your medical records clerk may not always be a project admin on a case, so that could be problematic. So when you're doing medical records task flow, sometimes it's just easier to do a follow-up on bills and records to this provider. And what I do sometimes is I will actually add instructions on do not complete this task until records are received here. And this way you don't have to use a repeating task and then trust the staff member to go in and reset that button. They can actually just instead not complete that follow-up task until those records come in. And then they can add notes here. Tell them, hey, you need to add, hey, we're still waiting on those records. They told me to call back Monday. They said they didn't get our fax request, whatever chasing of records needs to occur. And then they can always diary out their due date. I do tell firms, hey, do not tell your staff that they cannot diary out a due date without a note as to why. And then you can actually run audit reports to see if people are editing tasks without, putting in a note or anything like that. All right, so that is repeating tasks on an action button. And the next thing we've got here, that's kind of my little fun-filled just tips and tricks on Taskflows in general. I do have deadline chain that we can go over next too, and just how to build those and kind of how they work. If nobody has any questions on Taskflow before we move on to deadline chain.
I'll drop a link for the formatting, like support article from Filevine for the formatting that you see there that Amy did, the bolding, the purple text. I'll drop that in the chat. You all can use that throughout Filevine. So not just here in the activity feed, but any like instruction text you have, you can use that there as well.
Absolutely. It's a great thing. I have it bookmarked up here just to remind me. I have them memorized after a while, but it's great to travel down through their article and check it out. As she said, there you can use them throughout Filevine and instruction text, task flows, things like that. You can also actually use emojis as well in instruction text, just again to add visual to instructions whenever you're doing any kind of customization in your Filevine. All right, so deadline chains. Anytime a firm asks when should we use a task flow and when we should use a deadline chain, I usually recommend deadline chains for hard deadlines, whether they are internal or external. For example, case management orders. I know some states have statewide case management orders. For example, I'm pretty sure Florida still has one floating around where they're trying to push cases out that were off the docket because they were behind from COVID. So that's a great deadline chain. They get assigned and they're the same on every case that gets filed in litigation. They have the same deadlines on every case. So that's a great deadline chain. Service is a great deadline chain because you can actually trigger a chain more than once. So let's trigger a chain and I'll kind of walk through that a little bit. For example, service. Let's see here. My service chain. Grab it. Let's see. All right, service. All right, so we have our date suit is served, and here is a little instruction here. So enter date of confirmed service in the completed area right here. That is going to tell you that there are dates that are dependent upon that completed date. Since the date suit served is not a due date, it is a date that it was actually completed. So we can plug in today. And now we've got, hey, in 30 days, the defendant's response is due. What's great about deadline chains, as I mentioned, is you can actually trigger them for more than once in a case. So for instance, if you have more than one defendant and they get served at different times and you still need to track their response. So when they file an answer, things like that, you can actually come in here and we're going to rename this. So we can name this like, oh, defendant Smith. And then I'm going to trigger, going to come in here and add another chain. Whoops. For our other defendant here. Maybe I serve them on Monday. And then I'll show you guys what this looks like on the calendar. Because as we know, deadlines go on the project calendar and on anybody's calendar that is subscribed to the case. All right, awesome. So, and you can actually toggle between the chains by traveling up here into a little search bar. You can travel between the two chains here, our defendant. And let's pop into our project calendar here. So as you guys know, project calendar, and then we can actually take a look at, well, I like to look at this list view. It's pretty helpful. So you can kind of see how far out you're not having to dig through each month to see where your deadlines are. All right, awesome. So you'll see our defendant response due, and it'll tell you but because I renamed that chain, it tells me, okay, defendant Williams, and then we've got service on defendant Smith. So these are, we'll let you know the difference, and that's how they'll populate on your calendar too, if you're subscribed to the case. So renaming the chains, if you're going to use them this way in service, is going to be key in making sure that you're tracking it right. If you're wanting to use a chain instead of using a dead lane field or something like that. And of course, the best thing about dead lane chains is that it's auto-populating that due date based on what we've built already in the backend. And we can take a look at that here in a minute too. So let's say defendant, they turned around, they gave us a response early, and then it triggers some more dates here. And let's go in our other one so we can take a look at these on the calendar as well. All right, great. So I've got both triggered. We can toggle between the two again up here. And let's go back to the calendar. And let's view here. And then what's another great thing that I really like about deadline chains is they actually go ahead and say done. So we don't have to worry about, it doesn't remove it from the calendar. You're not going to get those reminders anymore. So we'll talk about those reminders here in just a minute as well. And to be careful about our reminder schedules. Those are things that people sometimes miss in implementation. But you know that deadline did exist, and hey, we've already gotten that answer back. So you don't have to worry about it. And let's go back to month. Oh, and it's loading, so we'll give it just a minute. So while we've got our loading here, then response due, and go back to our chain. So, all right. So now, and another great thing is if you ever need to manually move a date, so maybe you guys give an extension on the discovery to the defendant, you're like, okay, we'll give you a 30-day extension. Everybody knows people ask for extensions and they're granted on discovery all the time. Then you can actually diary it out manually here for that extension, and then you can add a little note here, granted extension, and just check it here. So you've got your note, and so you've diaried out and you've added your note, and that just helps you guys all keep up with what's going on deadlines and things like that. You also don't have to manually select the date here unless it's not on the same day. So let's say that they did answer our discovery yesterday. I just forgot to put it in there. So I do have to manually put it in here. But if they answer today, I can just check the little box here and it'll autofill the date in right there for us as well. All right, so let's go in the back end in deadline chains and take a look at how to set them up. So each deadline chain does need what's called a parent date or an anchor date. That's going to be the date you manually enter in to trigger everything else in the chain. So it's a chain, of course, so it's a chain of events that are triggered by an initial parent event or an independent date. And you don't necessarily need only one. You could have multiple independent dates that trigger off different things that occur in a case. Another great example of to use a deadline chain for is maybe you have a trial order that's going to be the same in a particular county with a specific judge. He has the same deadlines that occur as soon as you get that trial date. So service is great example, as I mentioned, because these are dates that populate after you get a service date. But you can also go the other way. Once you get that trial date, you can also have it things trigger earlier. So you get a trial date next September, you can have things trigger earlier that you'll see here. So I think it does take a little bit to kind of make sure you're triggering those right. I do suggest testing them as much as you can in a tax project, because as we know, deadlines are super important. So make sure you're testing them. They're behaving as you would expect, making sure you're getting that earlier and later. Again, deadline chains are probably another good one you can create a flow chart for outside of before you plug it in here, especially if you're going to make something super complicated. And you can have it triggered on a completed date or a due date. For example, if you're building one for a trial or pre-trial deadline chain, that's probably more than likely going to be a due date, because you still want to have the due date of the actual trial date, and then everything that triggers and leads up to it, like witness exhibit lists, things like that. Another thing that you want to keep up for, oh, and I just see why these deadlines did not populate, is because they were marked to hide on calendars. So those deadlines didn't pop up on your calendar because they were marked to hide in the calendar. So that is a feature. It is not automatic. This is not a default. This is something you do have to select. Just like dependent on another deadline, that is something you have to select too after you have your anchor, parent, or independent deadline right here. And then you go through and select your deadline that it is triggering from, gets completed or due. That's super important. So making sure you're making that selection correctly. And then you can have it due in days, weeks, months, years, whatever is applicable. And then you've got default is going to be whatever your org default is. Most of them are count every day. If you have a specific, you can build a specific judicial calendar. If somebody doesn't count weekends or something like that, then you can create a judicial calendar and plug it in there. And then that later or earlier, again, super important to figure out if this deadline is going to be triggered later or then your parent date or earlier. And then reminder schedules. So every single deadline in a deadline chain is going to need a reminder schedule for it. I have had clients that have had the pretty aggressive reminder schedule that just naturally comes with Filevine on every single deadline, and it can over inundate your staff or anybody that is subscribed to the case. So I do recommend building a reminder schedule for anything. Like let's say you have litigation deadlines and you want to just do like a 7-1, like, hey, 30-day reminder, 7-day reminder, or a 1 reminder. I would suggest building it and naming it so. And where do we do that? We do that here in reminder schedules. So I'm going to pop into our reminder schedules to kind of walk through that briefly real quick, just because I think they're so important to make sure that you assign a non-aggressive reminder schedule to something, especially if you're going to have a bunch of deadlines in a chain. This is where you can add a new reminder schedule. And what's really popular to do is to actually put the name of the reminders here in the schedule. So you can see here, this is a 7 days after, 2 days after, on due date, 2 days before, 7 days before, and you can put it in the name, or you can name it for what it's for. This is our reminder schedule for SOLs. This is our reminder schedule for discovery. This is for 90 days, any deadlines that occur in 90 days. These are great ways to name a reminder schedule for its specific use. So anybody that is an admin can make sure they're being assigned to the right one. And I've also seen some firms that like to use deadline chains to have physical reminders on calendars instead of using those reminders. And in that case, you want to make sure that you're not assigning an aggressive reminder schedule to a physical reminder on a calendar as well. All right. The only other thing in here to cover in deadline chains is making sure that if you're working on a chain, make sure you unpublish it. So that's going to make your circle right here go from green to this little yellow circle here. So if you're making any edits, you're going to want to unpublish it and work on it. So I usually do that, especially if I'm building a new chain. I'll keep it unpublished, publish it briefly to test it, and then unpublish it. Just so nobody's using it. I'll even name like test or demo in it. So especially in an active org to make sure nobody uses it. And then finally, there's one other deadline. You'll notice here, it says add group. The thing about deadline groups, this is when you're going to have multiple like paths of a deadline where you can have, maybe there's 3 deadlines. And if you complete one of them, it completes all of them. So I don't see too much usage of these because all the deadlines are pretty static. But if you ever do have an instance where you could have more than one deadline that just completes the whole group of deadlines, then the group is great for it. Basically kind of like an optional deadline. And then the group is for it. You would just add the different deadlines that it could possibly be here. And then when they populate, you complete one and it completes the whole group of the deadlines. All right. And gear here, you hit your gear here, you can rename the chain in the back end. You can actually plug in a jurisdiction in here too. This is so you guys know, hey, this chain is for this certain jurisdiction. For example, if you're building a case management order chain and you want to make sure you're plugging it into, this is only for this one district that we have in our area, and this helps your staff know. You can even plug in a URL to reference the local rules here or any notes. This is all internal notes for you guys that you can plug in right there. Same thing in here. There's a notes area right here. And I usually like to plug in just little notes here and there. The only thing about this notes area is that you won't innately see it unless it lives here. You'll have a little lowercase I that pops up. You have to hover it and then the note will pop out. So if it's something you want super important, then you're going to want to put it in the deadline like they did here. And another thing I've seen, the thing about deadlines is as well is that it does go to everybody that's subscribed to the case. So if you have a large team and it's not always clear who's handling that deadline, I've seen some firms actually put the name of the role of the person that should be handling it. Like, hey, maybe it's the senior paralegal. You can kind of put that there. If you have a larger team and you're not sure which role should be handling that or monitoring it, then you can actually put just that there. It doesn't only go to them. It's still going to go to everybody on the team. Everybody's still going to get reminders, but that's just kind of a little tip that you can use if that's ever becoming an issue where everybody's getting this deadline coming up and nobody's sure who's handling it. Sometimes if you make that assignment just in the name, like I said, it doesn't do anything else otherwise than just having those words in front of the deadline, instructing the staff as to who should be handling it. All right. And that is our deadline chains. One more thing that you can do to incorporate a deadline chain is you can always create a task flow or a task to trigger a chain and then add that link to the deadline chain section. For example, if you have a litigation chain you want to trigger, you can add a task to trigger a deadline chain just to make sure your staff knows to trigger it, especially if it's something new that you're implementing. That will help kind of incorporate a task flow switch to a deadline chain switch that a lot of firms do from pre-lit to litigation. All right, I think that's about it for me. Does anybody have any questions or anything?
Thanks so much, Amy. While we wait to see if there's any questions that come in, I did pop in the chat that support article, both mine and Amy's emails, so that if you have any questions or want to retain VineSkill services, you can reach out and we can get you set up. Our website is also linked in the chat, as well as our free help page that you can see upcoming topics if you want to join in any of our following weeks. And then also where you can find the recorded sessions for our free help, as well as additional training videos. So that's all in the chat there for you. Directly after this, there will be a lead docket webinar. You can access or sign up for that as well through that first link where it says free help. You can find upcoming topics here. You can sign up for the lead docket one there as well. So if you do have lead docket, would recommend. It's an open forum for you to be able to ask any questions that you have about your lead docket process. And I don't see any questions that have come up. Again, oh, there goes one. Okay, awesome. The videos for these webinars usually get posted the next day or maybe the day after. If you want it a little bit quicker, you can send me an email and I can send you the direct link to it. If you're looking to get some of this content, this great content that Amy gave to us today. Perfect. If there's no other questions, thank you all so much for joining us. We hope you learned something. And we look forward to helping learn with you all in the future. Awesome. Thanks so much, Amy.
Thank you, guys.
Have a good one. We'll talk to you all later.
Yay.
Bye-bye.